So I love Garfield. Everybody loves Garfield. But why do we love Garfield? What is it that makes the character so appealing? Because it's certainly not the films. So far, not a single Garfield film has been overall positively reviewed. We've gone from charming little stories like this to some of the strangest, craziest multiversal plot lines that I've ever witnessed. These were both written by the creator of Garfield, Jim Davis. What the hell happened here? Now, as of recording this part of the video, I haven't seen the new Garfield film because it's not out yet. However, by the end of the video, I will have seen it. There I am watching it now, having fun at the cinema. But to prepare myself for this, I thought I would watch every Garfield short and feature film in a row. Hence the title. I even bought my own little Garfield to watch the films with me. As you can see, I have kept him in mint condition. He likes it in there. It's cozy. I was going to make this video back in February, so he's been in here a while. There's time codes in the video, so feel free to skip around if you're not interested in certain films. And fair warning, I will be talking spoilers for all of the Garfield stuff, probably. I'm about to sit here and watch 12 hours of Garfield. I'm no Garfield expert, but I think he's a funny cat. Let's see if at the end that still rings true. Now, maybe I'll be eating my words, but I don't really have high hopes for this upcoming film. I'm gonna go in with an open mind, but my expectations are low. And that's because it's actually been a very long time since any Garfield media has been considered good by the wider audience. The most recent TV shows were far from groundbreaking successes. The video games leave much to be desired. That is, unless you read the Steam reviews, in which case Garfield Kart is probably the best game of all time. Even the comic strip itself has been widely criticized as being unfunny, although in saying that, how you would keep a 3-panel comic entertaining for almost 50 years, that's something that's truly beyond me. From what I can see, the most recent positively reviewed Garfield media would be the 1988 TV series Garfield and Friends, but even then, even saying that, at the time it was not positively reviewed. It's only really after the fact that it's been looked on more fondly. So really, the most recent positively reviewed Garfield media would be a series of Emmy-nominated shorts ranging from 1982 to 1991. Things are not looking good for my favorite cat. It has arguably been over 30 years since Garfield has starred in anything that has been looked on positively by the wider audience. Garfield first went into syndication in 1978, so looking at the timeline, an argument could be made here that there is more bad Garfield content than good. Yet Garfield still has such a strong appeal. He's got a hold over us. Enough of an appeal to be getting a new theatrically released film starring Hollywood's favorite voice actor Chris Pratt. That dude was just Mario. Can you imagine if there had not been a good Mario game in 30 years and then they released the Mario film? It wouldn't happen. But Garfield is so recognizable, so iconic, that they don't even need to put his name on the poster. Don't mistake me here. I love Garfield, and I recognize that there is a super dedicated Garfield fan base. My main issue with Garfield content is that his true potential is being underutilized. Although I currently can't speak for the new one, I think that every single Garfield film has portrayed the character wrong. I could just stand up here and tell you that these films are bad, but that's not really adding anything to the conversation. There's plenty of reviews from 20 years ago telling you how bad these are. I probably still will go into detail about why they're bad, but that's not what I want to do here. What I'm trying to do here is focus on how each film represents Garfield. They get the characterization and what makes Garfield appealing to a casual audience wrong. I understand that the value that I get out of Garfield is going to be potentially completely different from the next guy. It's a subjective opinion, and I'll address that as we go on. But if you've got any hot Garfield takes, make sure to leave them in the comments, whether or not you agree with anything I'm saying as we go on. So let's start with what I think makes Garfield Garfield. What does everyone know about him? You know, what's the first thing that pops into your head? He hates Mondays. He loves lasagna, bordering on addiction. We know he's lazy and sarcastic, and he's a big guy. To a lesser degree, people know that he loves a coffee and that he's smart and he's manipulative. He's good at getting what he wants and he doesn't care what other people think of it. Sometimes he thinks of himself as above other people, like with John and Odie. All of these traits are pretty easily identified, but I'm sure, as some of you have taken note, it's probably a little hard to center a long-form plot around a manipulative, sarcastic, lazy, self-centered addict. That's not exactly the kind of character who pushes a plot forwards. But to those people, I want to say that I just described the character of House, and that show ran for 177 episodes. On the topic of characters, while I think most people would recognize Garfield, John, and Odie, I think if I showed anyone these other characters, they would have no freaking idea who these guys are. So while a lot of people recognize Garfield, it doesn't really expand to the further lore of the series. So why even do a new film? Previous films didn't even come close to achieving the review scores or box office that they had hoped for. Well, I'm here to tell you that sometimes sometimes some things are more important than money. Sometimes it's about love. Unconditional love for a big, beautiful cat. But in this case, it was absolutely about money. It's just not box office money. While many of the previous films brought in mere millions of dollars, Garfield merchandise reportedly brings in $750 million to $1 billion per year. That's a lot of freaking lasagna. So one could imagine with this new upcoming film, that number's gonna go up. I'll give a recent example of this with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie. It had a budget of $70 million and it got $180 million at the box office. Generally, you gotta double the budget to account for the marketing costs. So on paper, for a large pre-existing franchise, $40 million isn't a great return. But then when you take into account the merch sales, they made over $1 billion last year. Really nailed a target audience with an authentic feeling film. On the merch sales alone, they greenlit a sequel. But while TMNT is typically targeted at teenagers, Garfield's for everyone, baby. Well, at least he should be. But so far, all the films have been pretty exclusively targeted at a very young audience. Which to a degree they should be, you know, he's a funny cat. But as I'll get into over this video, I think they've gone too deep into that audience. When Jim Davis first made Garfield in the 70s, he was looking specifically to create an appealing, marketable character. Dogs and comic strips were already being done to death, so he thought, I'll give a cat a whirl. When Garfield first showed up, he looked like this, but as you can tell over time, he's kind of become increasingly anthropomorphized, the kind of where we've landed at today. Now, in my opinion, this is my favorite version of Garfield, the more cat-like version, as opposed to the version that is standing up on 2 feet. Over time, for me, he feels more like a cartoon character who happens to be a cat, rather than a cat who is a cartoon character, if that makes sense. I think when Garfield is working best, he's working on 2 different fronts. First being relatable cat content, and then being relatable human content. Garfield has the attitude that a lot of people see in their cats, and a lot of the earlier Garfield stories depict kind of things that your cat would do, but with a little twist. He's doing cat things like pushing things off tables and stealing John's food. Cats steal things, so when Garfield steals John's pipe and then smokes it, it's funny because it's a cat, not because it's a cartoon. It's like the 70s version of a relatable cat meme. The other way I think Garfield works is on a human level, you know, we see ourselves in Garfield. He is the everyman, you know, he hates Mondays. Why would a cat hate Mondays? He hates them because we hate them, and that's something that's relatable to both adults and children. He's also living the dream. He gets to lie around all day. He doesn't care what anyone thinks of him. He loves a coffee. I love a coffee. That's so relatable. Don't talk to me before my morning coffee. Classic office talk right there. And that's why I believe people like Garfield and why he's so iconic and why people don't have the same attachment to, you know, normal. I think the more modern depictions of Garfield are completely missing the point of this. They've lost a sense of the character along the way. So let's have a look at all these films and we'll talk about how I think they got Garfield wrong. Finally, we're getting to the point. Sorry, I'm always rambling. So I thought to begin with, start off light, and I watched every single one of the Emmy-nominated short films of the 80s. Alright, I just watched all 12 of the shorts. There was definitely a couple I could have gone without, but yeah, overall pretty good. There's definitely some weird stuff in there though. Not gonna lie. What did you think, Garfield? Yeah, I thought exactly the same thing. We're not going to dwell on all of these, but there is a really interesting evolution of the character through these years. Every single one of these was nominated for a Primetime Emmy, and 4 of them won the award. Although, to be fair, in 1986, Garfield was only running against itself. In all of these, Garfield was voiced by Lorenzo Music. I think, personally, he is my favorite Garfield voice.
I hate mornings.
He and Bill Murray are close for me. These shorts also begin with these really catchy musical numbers. I freaking love these. I really hope the upcoming film uses one of these in like the intro bit. I think that'd be a cool throwback. Maybe I'm being hopeful though. First of these shorts is Here Comes Garfield. This one's going to be pretty important later, so I'm going to go into details about the plot. This short, Garfield and Odie mess around with a neighbor who, in retaliation, calls the pound. Garfield evades them, but Odie gets taken away. At first, Garfield isn't concerned, but over time, he realizes that he's bored, and then he realizes that he does miss Odie. So he goes to break Odie out, but then pretty quickly gets caught himself. It's here he finds out that by morning, Odie's gonna be put down. It's a really interesting dynamic because it's Odie's naivety that leads him to getting caught in the first place. And then when he's at the pound, he can't comprehend the circumstances that he's in. Dude's got no thoughts. And this puts Garfield in an interesting role because he worries for Odie because Odie can't worry for himself. The short also demonstrates that Odie is essentially Garfield's brother. They grew up together. With John, they are a family. So when a new family comes in to adopt a pet, Garfield is given a get out of jail free card. He's got a chance at a new family. But instead, he bolts, he causes a break break out and he frees Odie, and then they all run home together because he already has a family. The whole story is done in like 20 minutes. I don't think it's perfect, but it tells a really good, heartfelt story while staying true to Garfield as a character. His motivations are very believable. The second short is Garfield on the Town, in which he falls out of a moving vehicle and is stranded by himself. At first, he's doing all right. He's cool, he's calm, he's starting from scratch, but quickly he learns out that life on the streets ain't all it cracked up to be. He gets in a fight, and while he does well at first, he's quickly outnumbered, so he takes shelter in a familiar family Italian restaurant. Turns out this is where he was born. Ends up reconnecting with his mother, who introduces him to the rest of his family. He's got like a brother and a grandfather. They all end up having to band together to defend Garfield from the enemy cat gang. Overall, it's a really touching storyline. The dynamic with Garfield and his mother, I thought it was really sweet. It's a heartfelt story based around found family versus your birth family, and it's probably one of my favorites of the specials. I believe this is one of the ones that won the Academy Award. In the third short, Garfield in the Rough, Garfield fights a panther. Notably from here onwards, there is a change in the producers. I don't know if that has anything to do with the tone of the future storylines, but it gets different. Basic premise is that Garfield is depressed, so John, Garfield, and Odie go on a little holiday. They go camping, and obviously at first Garfield isn't keen, but over the course of it, he learns to see the beauty in nature. And then they get attacked by a panther. So there's a pretty big shift here in Garfield's character. Garfield starts becoming less of a cat in this short and more of John's child. And I get people refer to their pets as their children, and also a lot of people treat their pets as their children. But I would never ask my cat to go down to the stream and fetch some water for me. Garfield starts walking upright a little bit more. It's a little jarring, but I think overall in this, he does still seem like a cat. In Garfield's Halloween adventure, Garfield and Odie dress up as pirates and go trick-or-treating with all the other kids in the neighborhood. John's also super chill with it. He just tells them not to be out too late. There's a weird old man, there's ghosts, there's a ghost ship, there's pirate treasure. It's a whole lesson about greed. It's a kind of a little weird when you compare it to the last three. In my watch through, this is the moment that Garfield really stopped feeling like a cat for me. October 30th, 1985, almost 40 years ago. I think Garfield and Odie taking the role of children here was done very deliberately to make it more identifiable and appealing to a younger audience, make it more relatable, which I think for this is fine. At his core, Garfield is the same character here. The whole narrative, he's being spurred on by his desire to eat. He's tricking Odie into giving him all the candy that he gets. He says that all dogs have to give all their candy to cats. But then, after Odie saves his life, Garfield realizes the error in his way, and he shares the candy with Odie. We all get to learn a lesson. The next short, Garfield in Paradise, involves John and Garfield taking a flight to a place like Hawaii, but is not Hawaii. Garfield is dressed like a human here, otherwise he wouldn't get a seat. Odie snuck into the luggage. The place they're staying at is terrible, so they decide to rent a car to explore the island. The car is amazing, but it seems to have a mind of its own, and it drives itself to one of the native villages. The villagers, who are extremely offensively named the Ding Dongs, begin to worship the car. This one didn't age well. So it turns out in 1957, a guy named the Cruiser arrived in the village in a car very similar to this one, and he taught them the ways of the wider world. One day when the volcano was about to erupt, the Cruiser sacrificed himself to the volcano to prevent it from destroying the village. Back in present day, the car stops working, so Odie and one of the villagers has to work on the repairs, while John and Garfield fall in love with the village princess and her cat. The cat's name is Mai Tai. The romance is interrupted when the volcano begins to erupt, and the only way it can be sated is by the princess and her cat being sacrificed. John and Garfield just kind of let this happen. However, the volcano rejects their sacrifice. Odie ends up getting the car working, and they race into the volcano. The volcano doesn't destroy the village, and the ghost of the Cruiser flies into the sky, and miraculously Odie and the other guys survive, and everybody celebrates. Hooray. 2.5 years before this, we had a very heartwarming story about Garfield meeting his mother. Now we have stories about ritual sacrifice. Now, the reason I've focused on this special specifically is because it is one of the most significant ones. Jim Davis has confirmed that out of all the TV specials, this is his favorite one. So in a way, this kind of represents what he wants Garfield to be. Not a stay-at-home cat who hates Mondays and loves lasagna. I checked, neither of these things are brought up in the short. What I feel like Jim Davis really likes here is a kind of wacky cartoon world. Garfield didn't even do much in this. He was just kind of along for the ride. And while it doesn't align with what I like about the character of Garfield, or what resonates for a lot of the casual audience, we can't ignore here what the creator's been trying to do since the 80s. The next two we're not going to focus too much on. Garfield Goes to Hollywood. He enters a pet talent show, and he makes it to the finals in Hollywood. They do well on the local level, but they get outclassed in the finals. In that same year, they released Garfield's Christmas, in which Garfield spends Christmas with John's family. That's pretty much it. It gets a little more into its heartfelt roots, and it makes Garfield feel a little more like a cat again. It's a good balance. It's fine. I didn't mind it. Garfield His 9 Lives is probably the craziest out of all the shorts. It follows the 9 reincarnations of Garfield, because of course cats have 9 lives. Some of these have different art styles, and they're all very different tonally. It's actually quite an interesting concept. It's based off a comic of the same name made by Jim Davis, although some of the stories are different. For example, they don't adapt the story in which Garfield is possessed by a primal spirit, resulting in him murdering his owner. That's a real story written by Jim Davis. Why wouldn't they adapt this one? That being said, they do adapt some darker stories. There's one where he's a lab animal being tested on, and there's a really kind of beautiful, sad story called Diana's Piano. There's some weird, surreal, vaguely religious stuff, and there's also, there's classic Garfield stuff. It kind of borders on Looney Tunes at a time. Also, the very end implies that God, the creator of the universe, is a future reincarnation of Garfield. I really like this special. I really like seeing Jim Davis branch out creatively with the character. It goes in so many different directions, and it honestly feels very ahead of its time. As we'll see later on, he really likes taking the character in a variety of different ways, and I think this was a really good vessel to do that. It also makes it more interesting when you consider like the fan creations of Garfield now, like with the Eldritch Horror stuff, or Garfield without Garfield. Out of all the shorts, this is the one that I felt deserved an Emmy the most. It didn't though. It didn't win the Emmy, but the next one wins one. The Emmy Award went to Garfield, Babes and Bullets. In this, Garfield is bored and he imagines himself as a film noir detective. I surprisingly really liked this one. It's super weird. Without a doubt for me, it definitely felt like the funniest out of all of them. If they replaced Garfield with a regular human, honestly, the short wouldn't change a lot, and that's kind of where the humor's found. And I think Garfield using his imagination for all the craziest stuff, it's a really good midway point compared to some of the craziest stuff that we see later on. Garfield's Thanksgiving, I think, is probably the most Garfield-y out of all the shorts. Maybe they felt the need to do this considering how weird the last ones were. It's got Garfield being an actual cat, John's being an absolute frickin' moron. It's got Liz's first appearance as a main character in the shorts. In my marathon, it felt very refreshing. It felt like a Garfield comic strip come to life. Garfield's Feline Fantasies was up next, in which he imagines himself in like a variety of different scenarios. It's a bunch of movie references. It mainly focuses on a James Bond kind of Indiana Jones style storyline. It's a much more unfocused, much less funny version of Garfield, Babes and Bullets. It definitely feels like they took the wrong lesson from that one. And the final short is called Garfield Gets a Life. This is the only one not to be directed by Phil Roman. It's also falsely titled. It should be called John Gets a Life, because the plot revolves around Garfield taking John out of the house and teaching him how to meet women. And that's all the shorts. I think my favorites were 9 Lives, Babes and Bullets, and On the Town. And the ones that I enjoyed least were probably Goes to Hollywood, Feline Fantasies, and with great apologies to Jim Davis, Garfield in Paradise. I even watched that one again after I found out that that was Jim Davis's favorite. I tried to see what he enjoyed in it, but it's not for me. I'd love to know your opinions on it though. I saw that all of them are for free on YouTube. One thing I thought that was really interesting is that some of the characters who appear later on, like Nermal and Arlene, they don't show up at all in these, even though they definitely existed in the comic strip at the time. One thing I got out of all this is that it really helped me assess what I like to see in Garfield and what I don't. There was honestly more variety in here than I expected. I think it was a very transitional time for Garfield. I also didn't expect to enjoy so many of them, but I think most interestingly, we can see how these maybe affected some future Garfield films. Specifically, I knew that one wasn't gonna hold up, but damn, I thought that was the good one. It's all meant to be downhill from here. He's having fun. I am not having fun. Garfield's first major film came out in 2004, and it was appropriately named Garfield the Movie. Not to be confused with 2024's The Garfield Movie. This stars Bill Murray as Garfield, Breckin Meyer as John, and Jennifer Love Hewitt as Liz. It also currently has a 14% on Rotten Tomatoes. Back in my youth, I really loved this film, and when I first watched Zombieland, I was mortified to hear that Bill Murray regretted this film.
You have any regrets?
Garfield, maybe?
But I do think he had a really good voice for Garfield. Now, if you've never seen it, or it's been a long time since you've seen it, let me fill you in. CGI Garfield lives with regular human John, and life is great. He gets into shenanigans with the local cat Nermal, and he eats lots of lasagna. Also on the street is Arlene, Luca the dog, and Lewis, who is a mouse or rat. You may notice here, if you look really closely, that Garfield is the only fully CGI character. This might be a really controversial take, but I think Garfield looks amazing in this. Is it a little strange? Yeah, absolutely. But I like it, and I'm wrong, and that's okay. John takes Garfield on one of his frequent vet trips to go see Liz, where she convinces him to adopt the dog Odie. Odie proves to be a bit of a burden for Garfield, but also sometimes he comes in handy. They bond a little while listening to the song Hey Mama by the Black Eyed Peas, but when he's seen by Arlene and Nermal, Garfield gets embarrassed. John and Liz go on a date to a dog show, bringing Odie with them, and Garfield sneaks along, and all the dogs at the show proceed to chase Garfield, leading Odie to steal the show with his sick dance move, and this catches the eye of Happy Chapman. He's a television show who works with cats, but also hates cats, and he's looking for a dog to be a part of his new act. When Garfield gets home, he accidentally destroys the house, which leads to him being kicked out for the night, and then Odie comes out to keep him company, and then Garfield repays him by leaving Odie outside. Odie runs away during the night and is found by an old woman. She puts up all these posters, and Happy Chapman recognizes the dog, so he comes and then he claims Odie as his own. Meanwhile, Garfield is shamed by all the other animals on the street. Then Odie makes his TV debut, which only Garfield sees, which prompts Garfield to go on an adventure across the city. He needs to get to the studio before Happy Chapman leaves with Odie forever. Along the way, he's almost eaten by rats, he's rescued by Lewis, he crosses a road Toy Story style, he climbs through vents, he meets up with Odie, who is then taken away again, surfs down a stairwell, falls off a skyscraper, and then is captured by animal control. Garfield also says this:
"Guard, may I have some shoelaces, please?"
I don't know how to take that one. There is so many prison jokes across all of the films. It is a weird trope that keeps coming up. Meanwhile, John and Liz are searching for Odie. At the pound, Garfield meets Happy Chapman's cat Sir Roland, who has now been abandoned. Sir Roland is moved by Garfield's story, so when a family comes in to adopt him, he stages a breakout. Garfield races to the train station where he almost causes a national disaster. He rescues Odie, and then all of the animals from the whole film, they all beat up Happy Chapman, and then John shows up and punches him. John and Liz end up together, and then Garfield learns how to live with Odie. The end. So one thing I noticed watching this film so close to all the TV specials is that there are remarkable similarities between this film and the first of the TV specials, Here Comes Garfield. In both of these, Garfield is partially responsible for Odie being taken away. At first, Garfield doesn't really care, but he eventually rationalizes that he should rescue him. Deals with potentially never seeing him again. Even the whole pound breakout scene is remarkably similar. The only difference is that Sir Roland is making the sacrifice for some reason, instead of Garfield. It even involves all the animals ganging up and taking out a stronger human character. All this makes me wonder if this was originally meant to be a remake. Or maybe these are just like references or something, I don't know. However, in my opinion, this film is much worse than the short Here Comes Garfield. To start off, Garfield's motivations for rescuing Odie in this feel shallow to me. In the TV special, we see that Garfield at first tries not to care, but then eventually does. Because we learn that they have years and years of shared history together. They grew up together, and Garfield is a brother to Odie. He cares deeply for him, even though at first he didn't want to admit it. In this film, Garfield has known Odie for like a day. All they've bonded over is the Black Eyed Peas. So is Garfield the lazy, self-centered cat rescuing Odie because he's a good guy? Or is it because all the other pets in the neighborhood shamed him? Because if it's that one, we suddenly now have Garfield caring what other people think of him, which I guess for me doesn't resonate with the character. Now let's move on to another issue, which is gonna come up consistently through the rest of the video. Garfield is meant to be lazy and, to put it kindly, unathletic. And to be fair to this film, at times he is. That is until they don't know how to use that anymore, and then suddenly he is solving every problem with his incredible athletic ability. Where Garfield should overcome things is with his mind. He should be able to outwit people. But consistently, and this will become more prevalent as we go on, the writing isn't good enough to allow him to do that. So they just allow him to constantly achieve greater and greater feats of athleticism. There's probably only 2 instances of Garfield actually being smart in this film. First is the crazy milk contraption, and then the other is maybe when he's conducting the trains. We can't really count the last one because that almost ended in tragedy. And then the milk thing, I don't think Garfield is meant to be physics smart. He's meant to be wit smart, manipulative smart. I feel like he should be the smartest in the room, and in this, a lot of the time he is, but it's because everyone else is a moron. In the comic strip, Garfield is often portrayed as a foil to John, who is a big idiot. In this film, John is not a big idiot, he's just a regular guy. This means Garfield has no dynamic with him. There's no chance for him to be critical of John, and when he is being critical, he's mostly just being completely unreasonable. Speaking of John, they made absolutely no attempt to make him like the comic strip version at all. Maybe that's for the better though, I don't know. The same kind of deal with Liz. It feels like they've just gone out of their way to make them as bland as possible. I freaking love Jennifer Love Hewitt. Alright, let her act. That being said, what I did like about this film is I really like that Garfield is a cat. He's not just a cat until it doesn't suit the plot anymore. He is a cat consistently throughout it. He is always a cat. Feels weird to say that, but it'll make more sense later. If I was to change the film, there's two ways I'd do it, two different ways. Maybe have Garfield and Odie raised together, like in the original material. It gives Garfield more of a reason to save him, it gives higher emotional stakes. It gives Garfield a chance to think that at first, while he thought he didn't care or didn't like Odie, that he actually does, and that he took him for granted. Alternatively, keep the whole beginning the same, but instead, Happy Chapman wants a cat, not a dog. Have him think that there's already too many dogs in media, kind of mirroring what like Jim Davis felt when he first made Garfield. Garfield has superior dance moves to Odie anyway, so this is not much of a stretch. Then Garfield gets taken by Happy Chapman, and Odie has to rescue him. This puts Garfield in a situation where he can constantly outwit the villain and be a nuisance to him. Instead of having a dynamic with John, Garfield can have a dynamic with the villain. While also Odie gets a side plot where he goes out on an adventure to rescue Garfield. And in doing this, he proves his value to Garfield. I think this would reflect the characters better, Garfield's desire to go home and his wit, while also demonstrating Odie's loyalty. I think I'm losing it because I liked that one. This is like the BuzzFeed marathon all over again. I no longer know if my feelings are genuine, so maybe my mind is broken. Next up is Garfield: A Tale of Two Kitties, a film that did not need to be a Garfield movie. It's a remake of the classic story Prince and the Pauper. Now, I think on paper this is a really funny idea for Garfield, but that's all it is, a funny idea. They don't nail it. It's got a 12% on Rotten Tomatoes. I think that's a little harsh. I think it's better than the previous film. So John wants to propose to Liz, but she's got to go to England for a animal conference. John decides to follow her to England and surprise her to propose to her there. Garfield and Odie sneak into the luggage. Garfield's initial motivations here are to prevent John from proposing to Liz. Garfield wants John all to himself. So, in a way, it's the same motivations as the previous film, just instead of Odie, it's Liz. They don't even really demonstrate John not paying attention to Garfield for Liz. I guess even they thought they were treading too much of the same ground there. If this marathon has taught me anything, 1980s Garfield would have loved John moving forwards in a relationship. Now in England, there's a cat who looks just like Garfield. His name is Prince, and he's voiced by Tim Curry, aka Nigel Thornberry. His owner is Lady Carlisle, who's recently passed away, leaving the entire estate to the cat. This is much to the disappointment of Lord Dargus, who is Billy Connolly's character. He wanted the estate, so he has the measured response of throwing the cat in a river. You may have guessed that this dude is a little unstable. The ultimate motivation is to turn the grounds into a resort and then feed all the animals to the guests. And now with Prince out of the way, he's next in line to get the inheritance. John arrives in England and surprises Liz, and then Garfield and Odie surprise them both. They're not nearly as concerned as they should be over how illegal this is, especially considering Liz is there for some kind of animal conference. Garfield and Odie end up going out in the town, and along the way, Garfield is confused for Prince, and Prince is confused for Garfield. Dargus, thinking Prince has returned, participates in many schemes to off Garfield, but along the way he keeps getting thwarted by all the other animals in the house. He needs to get this cat out of the way before the lawyers find out that he's actually alive. Garfield also teaches all the animals how to make lasagna to the tune of another Black Eyed Peas song. While Garfield and Prince both kind of enjoy their switched situations, they realize that they do miss their homes. Eventually they meet up, and they both decide that they gotta take Dargus out for good. So at this point, all they gotta do is prove to the lawyers that Prince is alive. That's all they gotta do. We need one cat to walk into one room in front of a couple of different people, and then all the animals are saved. Doesn't even matter which cat it is, they look the same. But instead, they run around for 10 minutes gaslighting the guy, pushing him to the point of literal insanity. And while a lot of the animals best Dargus by outwitting him, Garfield beats him by running really fast. This all accumulates with Billy Connolly threatening everyone with a crossbow. Odie and John then come to the rescue, but then there's another standoff, and then they're rescued by some weasel. Who is this? Who invited this guy? And then there's a pool party at the end. Overall, to me, this film felt a lot more fun than the first one. I think it was a big step up in terms of that. I actually found myself enjoying parts of it. But again, it feels a lot less of a Garfield story. Other than like a few mentions of lasagna, this didn't really need to be Garfield. Towards the end of the film, when Garfield and Prince first meet, it's not actually Prince who suggests that they beat Dargus. Prince suggests that they run away. It's Garfield who convinces everyone to fight back, which I don't think is really in line with Garfield. He was leaving here. He could have left. I think it would have been more impactful if Prince really wanted to save his home, but he needed Garfield's help because Garfield is the only one who was able to consistently outwit Dargus. This film again felt like Garfield was helping out just because he's a good guy, which I don't think is a great motivation for the character. I think I just enjoyed this one because Billy Connolly did a good job. I
I can't express how bad that was. I think that's one of the craziest creative decisions that I've ever seen.
This is probably the biggest jump in source material that I've ever seen in anything ever. This came out in 2007 and it is fully written and produced by Jim Davis himself. In fact, he started writing it in 1996, so 11 years beforehand. He spent a lot of time cooking with this one. And it's directed by the guy who did Spawn. Garfield is voiced by Frank Welker. You would recognize his voice. He's done a lot of stuff in the past, but probably most notably, he's Fred Jones from Scooby-Doo. I think he did a pretty good job in this, but it takes me out a little bit sometimes because he also voices like half of the cast. Alright, it's plot time. Here we go. Stay with me here. In this, Garfield, John, and Odie all live in a cartoon world where they work as actors who work in a comic strip which is beamed into print media into the real world. They live in an alternate world parallel to our own, only connected through the media of comic strips. Is this making sense? So yeah, you're with me. In this, Garfield and John are not owner and pet. They're colleagues. They can actively converse with each other. They're roommates. They carpool to work to a big building shaped like Garfield. They work with other characters like Billy Bear and Randy Rabbit who supposedly have comic strips of their own.
You're the star of a comic strip.
This is like if the Hunger Games movie had Katniss Everdeen as an actor playing her character for the book. I guess it's kind of like Wreck-It Ralph, except Ralph isn't a pre-existing character. It's like if Wreck-It Ralph was about Zangief and they called it Wreck-It Zangief, which, come to think about it, is absolutely a film I would watch. So Garfield, John, and Odie all act like their regular selves to a degree. There are some changes though. For example, John is surprisingly competent. Odie's almost completely unchanged. For some reason, having him being able to talk would have been too much of a stretch. Considering he's the only character in here who can't talk, it's got some weird implications. Arlene and Nermal are in this, and they are actors for the comic strip as well. Liz, surprisingly, is not in this at all. Garfield still hates Mondays, but he now actually has a reason to hate them. He's got to go to work. And that's kind of the plot of the film, is that he is bored of work. He's bored of the catchphrases, he's bored of the jokes. He is bored of his existence. It's almost like Jim Davis is expressing something here about making Garfield for so long. We're bombarded with a bunch of new characters. Obviously, I've already mentioned Billy Bear and Randy Rabbit. There's the inventor Walter, who has a very mean-spirited wife named Benita. There's Betty, who for some reason is built different. There's Eli. There's Keith. There's Prop Boy. There's Zelda the catering wench. There's some kind of workplace harassment dog. We didn't need this character. There's the director, who for some reason, again, is built different. And then my personal favorite character, Frog Bin. After a hard day at work, they beam the comics into the real world. There's like this cinema where they can sit and they can watch people's reactions to reading the comics. Now, keen-eyed viewers would be able to identify here that something looks a little off with the real world. Well, that's because it's also animated. It is done in a very similar style. It is a little darker, but that's kind of it. It makes me wonder if this bit was originally meant to be live action. This film is very much for children, but it feels like such a confusing concept. Especially for the mid-2000s, there wasn't a whole lot of multiversal stuff on screen. Anyway, Garfield gets Eli to zoom in on the hot dogs, and Garfield is enamored. Finally, he is feeling love in his heart again. Now, you may be thinking here, hot dogs? Why the hell Garfield care about hot dogs? Garfield liked lasagna. Well, I got some bad news for you. Garfield does not mention lasagna once in the entire film. He likes hot dogs now. Anyway, Garfield goes through a tear in the screen and he enters the real world and becomes more like a real cat. Eli explains that the comic world is pressurized like an airplane, so while you can go through, you can't come back in. Garfield is permanently in the real world. And then Odie goes through because his bone went through. They end up meeting some strays and Garfield realizes that the real world isn't all it's cracked up to be. There's a cat named Shecky. There's a British lady cat that makes Arlene jealous. With Garfield no longer in the comic world, he finds out that his comic strip, surprisingly, is gonna be cancelled. But the newspaper company is doing tryouts to be the next Garfield. So of course, Garfield and Odie go. There's a bunch of crazy characters pitching their ideas for cartoons. What's weird to me here, though, is that if we've got real world people pitching their cartoon ideas, then what is the cartoon world? Did they get sent to the cartoon world, or did the creations spontaneously form in the cartoon world? Real world Garfield and Odie got approved, Does then a new Garfield and Odie get created in the cartoon world? Do they? I don't know. They don't explain this, and it keeps me up. Anyway, the newspaper people did not like Garfield and Odie because they deemed them to be problematic, and they want to go with these two jacked bodybuilder animals instead. But because they've had so much success with Garfield, he's the best comic of all time, they're gonna give him one more day, one more chance. I'm gonna skip ahead because we've been on this a little too long. Garfield, Odie, and Shecky have been tied up by the bodybuilding animals and they've set the building alight. Garfield is going to burn to death. So the comic characters, spurred on by Walter, build a big invention to allow them to cross between the realities. Now, the whole film, Walter has been getting bullied and disrespected by his wife, Benita. But in this climactic moment, he insults her, and then she gets really turned on.
The blade on the front reminds me of that big honking nose of yours.
You are so forceful.
This was a weird thing to include. Now, throughout the whole film, Arlene has been watching over Garfield. She never left the cinema. The whole time she's been saying that she should go there and be with him. So the whole time, I'm watching this thinking she's gonna have a huge moment where she goes through and rescues him. They need 3 volunteers now to go through the screen. Walter, John, and Arlene put their hands up, but then Billy Bear says that he should go instead of Arlene because he's much bigger and stronger, which I guess is true because he's a bear, but it's such a weird thing. They were setting up the whole film Arlene going through the bloody screen, and then she never does. She just gets pushed aside. From a narrative point, this is just such a weird thing to include.
Let's go, men.
We even find out in the real world Billy Bear is not strong at all. He can't break down the bloody door, so they need to fit through a small hole to get in. Surely Arlene has the size advantage here. She could go through the hole and unlock the door. But no, they just all go through the hole. They were setting her up from the beginning. Why is Walter going through? Have Arlene go through instead. He's had his big moment. Anyway, they save them and they all make it back to the comic world. And I guess Shecky just lives in the comic strip now. Now, while this is undeniably a Garfield film, what the hell were they thinking here? This film was very, very clearly targeted at a young audience, but I think it's too confusing for a young audience to understand. There's not even any, like, brand synergy here. Fans of this aren't going to be able to transfer to the comic strip because they're different guys. One is Garfield, and one is the actor who plays Garfield. This film actively works against the brand. Kids might watch this and think that Billy Bear is their favorite character, but then find out that Billy Bear doesn't exist. He doesn't have a comic strip. He's not even in the Garfield comics. They made him for this film. Where's my Walter merchandise? I love Walter. This isn't an accessible way into the comics because the foundation, the dynamics, the basic premise are wrong. And then to make matters worse, they made 2 sequels to this film. That's right, this is the first film in a trilogy. The first film in the Garfield comic strip universe.
That one is definitely the worst one so far. I think even if I hadn't been watching Garfield for hours, that would have sucked.
Garfield's Fun Fest makes the boldest claim any film ever could possibly make, that it is funny. This features the same cast of characters as the last one. It, in the continuity, takes place after, because Shecky does make an appearance. Surprisingly, this film was really well received. It got a 4 paw review from... Who's this? Odie? He's in the movie. Ugh, they got me. Yeah, this film's terrible. So coming up in Garfield's workplace is the Fun Fest. It's a talent show where whoever has the most fun wins. Each year, Garfield wins with his stand-up performance, which he does with Arlene. We get a little taste of this. This is last year's winning performance.
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a darn.
He does movie impressions, the highest form of comedy. Arlene is just kind of used as a prop, so this year she wants to do a dance routine with Garfield. Garfield refuses, so Arlene teams up with Ramon, who is a very handsome cat. When Garfield performs alone in rehearsals, he realizes something tragic. He's not funny. It also doesn't help that all 3 of the female judges absolutely froth over Ramon. Really glad they gave Betty and Benita more to do in this film. That's a joke, because all they do is this. Anyway, this results in Garfield and Odie needing to go on a magical adventure to the mystical forest to find the funny water. This whole film feels like a weird, almost introspective piece on the character of Garfield. A huge criticism that Garfield, both the comic strip and the character, have gotten is that it's unfunny. So again, it's like real life is being reflected into the plot here. The last movie was about Garfield feeling dissatisfied with his repetitive existence, and now this film's about him being unfunny. There's no such thing as a coincidence. In this movie, after Garfield first bombs literally every single character all they do is tell Garfield how unfunny he is. Along the way in the mystical forest, Garfield interacts with several characters who teach him lessons in comedy. There's Stanislavski the squirrel, there's our really annoying bear. It all accumulates with Garfield meeting Freddy the Frog, who is the first funny animal. No one was funny before Freddy. This is easily the worst of all the films. But also, I think any film that has to constantly reassure the audience that it is funny is kind of doomed from the start. The writing isn't good enough, so every character has to rely on physical comedy. Half the characters for FunFest just end up dancing. It also fundamentally misunderstands the humor of Garfield. There's one point where Freddy the Frog is trying to teach Garfield comedy, and he just water tortures him until Garfield admits that he's fat. That's not really comedy. I think for a character like Garfield especially, self-depreciating humor is not what he should be doing. It's kind of the opposite of who he is. He should love who he is. That being said, one of the lessons Garfield learns in the forest, I think summarizes the film really well. Garfield and Odie are trying to cross a river, but they are prevented in doing so by some alligators. The only way to cross is to make them laugh. He does a stand-up routine and he gets no response, so some birds in a tree give him a helpful tip. Play to your audience, even if it means being foolish. So they do physical comedy and then they're able to cross. And this kind of really summarizes what the film's trying to do. Although for me, the humor doesn't work. I'm not the intended audience, the children are. The children are alligators. Garfield and subsequently Jim Davis are learning to change the humor of Garfield to fit a different audience. So while I think this film is terrible and not funny, I get what it's trying to do. To me, it just doesn't really feel like Garfield at all. But I guess that's the point. Also, if you haven't guessed, the water is just regular water. They do a Space Jam. The funny was inside Garfield all along. Also, Ramon was normal in a robot suit, which has incredibly creepy implications. He was pulling some really weird shit. Bloody lock this cat up.
Garfield's Pet Force.
That one felt like a fever dream. Why was everyone cheeked up in that one? Why did they do that?
Now, if Garfield gets real, jump the shark in terms of Garfield media, Garfield's Pet Force jumps the shark in terms of the animated trilogy. This one expands the multiverse even further. As we all remember, there is the comic strip universe and then the real world. This film adds a third layer. These comic books, I believe, only exist in the comic strip universe. This comic book universe is a world of its own. But similar to the real world to the comic strip universe doesn't believe that the comic book universe is real, but it is real. It's the kind of thing Normal reads for entertainment. Are you with me? So in the comic book universe, John is a loser king. He's the king of planet Dorkon. Dorkon these nuts. And alternate Walter is his second in command. And Walter has invented a device which scrambles the molecules between individuals or people and items, and it also makes them completely subservient. So already 5 minutes in, we're introduced to the most terrifying, monstrous weapon I could ever conceive. Walter was ready to do war crimes. Now John is too dorky, even for Dorkonian women, so he doesn't have a wife. And that's when alternate Liz shows up, who is known as Vet Vix. This is Liz's first appearance in the trilogy, and she's evil. She also kind of built different. Anyway, she and John get married on the spot, and immediately she takes the weapon and uses it to take over the kingdom. Walter summons the Pet Force, who are alternate versions of Garfield, Odie, Arlene, and Nermal. And as you can tell, they're all built kind of different, except for Nermal. He already had his handsome arc in the previous film. He didn't need another glow up. They've all got unique powers. Odious has a stun tongue. Nermal can move at super speeds. Starlina has an icy stare. And Garzuka can shoot radioactive hairballs. Even with these amazing abilities, they are instantly defeated. So of course Garzuka needs to flee to an alternate universe to give his teammates genetic duplicates powers of their own so they can all fight Vet Vix. Vet Vix follows Garzuka through because Garzuka stole the crystal that powers the device. And Garzuka entrusts the crystal to regular Garfield for some reason. Garfield is kept pretty separate from the usual suspects this whole film. Garfield never gets powers of his own. However, he is kidnapped and tortured. It doesn't really work though, because Garfield has some kind of Toon Force-like ability. They can squish him and they can stretch him and it doesn't hurt him. That being said, they do get the crystal off him, and then Vet Vix, proceeds to just blast away at the general populace. She even goes and messes up Garfield's place of work. Recurring characters like Billy Bear and Randy Rabbit are done in. We're in the end game now. Garzuka gets the main cast and Frogbin for some reason out of there, and Garfield just falls from the sky. The serum kicks in, and Odie, Arlene, and Nermal are all given their superpowers, so they promptly leave, leaving John and Frogbin to die or be merged. You know, it's a fate worse than death. Now a zombie movie, and the Pet Force instantly gets overwhelmed. So Garfield decides to make his own super team out of the survivors. They call the team Crazy Crew, and in this team is Eli, Walter, Benita, Betty, and of course Garfield himself. In this scene, he hypes everyone up. He calls Walter a pint-sized hero, and then he proceeds to call Betty man-hungry and Benita a super nag. It's pretty poor form, Garfield, but I'm glad you gave Betty and Benita more to do in this film. So I guess props for that. I didn't mention this earlier, but Betty is absolutely frothing over Garzuka. So Garfield and Walter dress up as Garzuka to distract all the zombies, while Garzuka and the Pet Force harpoon the spaceship. Eli's like the tech guy on the computer. So what about the rest of Crazy Crew? What about Betty and Bonita? What's their role in this? Well, they act as greeters. They vaguely suggest which direction the zombies should go, which is the direction they were already going. They didn't even try to do anything with these characters. As this is happening, Vet Vic super scrambles the Pet Force into some hideous monstrosity. An amalgamation too terrifying for a film like this, and she also makes a giant monster out of buildings. Due to the stress of the situation, Betty and Bonita both faint. Garfield tells Eli to get them to safety. He's got to do this alone. He airdrops from a spaceship, landing onto the giant monster. Using his superior athletic ability, he's able to both outmaneuver the monster and the Pet Force blob. He outmaneuvers them at every turn, getting them to destroy each other. The weapon lands in Garfield's hands and he uses it to turn everything back to normal. Garfield then uses the weapon to fuse a happiness field with Vet Vix, permanently changing her disposition. And then she and John get married. I don't know about the ethics of this one. Well, I do know about the ethics. It's bad. Not only did they rewrite her personality, the weapon makes people subservient. Yeah, this whole video went in such different directions than what I expected. Garfield and Arlene then proceed to fly off into space and then explode. I don't think I need to explain why this one, out of all the films, doesn't feel like Garfield. Obviously, none of these films felt like your typical Garfield. And until very recently, most of the Garfield films took place in this continuity, one that doesn't align at all with the TV specials, the live action, or even the comic strip. Kids who grew up with these films see Garfield as this. Not as a cat, but as the star of a comic strip. A guy who can actively converse with John, has employees, and loves hot dogs. Okay, so I'm back from my early screening of the Garfield movie, and while this definitely wasn't the worst Garfield film, it definitely wasn't the best. At least in my opinion. It definitely, again, was really targeted at that younger audience. I understand that I'm not the target here, but I still should be able to get enjoyment out of those kinds of films. I believe with films like, Finding Nemo or Chicken Run or Puss in Boots or Lion King, I can still get value out of those. This I couldn't. It didn't have a lot of heart, and the jokes felt pretty painfully flat a lot of the time. I was there for the 10 a.m. screening, which was the earliest possible session I could see for this film, and this was an early screening, so days before it came out anywhere else in Australia. So pretty much the entire audience here were kids and Garfield super fans. From where I was sitting, there was maybe only 5 or 10 moments where the audience audibly laughed, like a proper laugh. By theory, this session would have been their most dedicated audience, and out of them, they could only squeeze between 5 and 10 laughs. So when it comes to the wider public, I don't know how well it's going to go down here. Personally, I didn't do any laughing except for one moment where a kid in the cinema fell down the stairs. Chris Pratt as Garfield really didn't do it for me, but I don't think this was his fault. There's a clip I saw on TikTok earlier where he does the voice for Mario, Emmett, and Garfield all in a row.
Mario does this little thing. He's like, he's kind of like this. He's a little more like this. And then, Emmett Brickowski. Emmett is a little more like this. And then Garfield is kind of, he's like my own voice if I was about to yawn.
I think for this film, having Chris Pratt change his voice and have that slower cadence would have been really good, but the writing didn't really allow for that. Garfield has really high energy through this whole thing, so he just ends up sounding like regular Chris Pratt. I think for most people, that's going to be completely fine. The rest of the voice cast was pretty good. There was some pretty big names in it. The general gist for this film is that Odie and Garfield are kidnapped during the night by 2 dogs, but they're rescued by Vic, who is Garfield's biological father. It turns out that the kidnapping was organized by Jinx, who is an old associate of Vic, and she did it to lure him there because she's got a bone to pick with Vic. On a milk heist years ago, he left her behind and she got kidnapped and was put in the pound for years. She wants retribution, so she wants to be repaid in like 1,000 gallons of milk. So she forces our 3 main characters to go on a milk heist. I'm gonna start off by saying what I liked about the film. I thought the animation and the character design was really good, really accurate to Jim Davis's original works, visually super nice, and it's a super good translation in that way. It also addresses one of the big issues I had in all of the previous films. In this, Garfield doesn't choose to go on an adventure, he's literally kidnapped. The dude is forced to participate, he doesn't want to be there. For me, that is where the positives end in this film. I do think that, again, this is a case where the fundamentals of Garfield really aren't present, at least not in a meaningful way. Don't get me wrong, he hates Mondays and he loves lasagna. That's where the similarities end. At the beginning of the film, there's a fun little montage of all these clips that ring very true to the skits from the original comic strips. That was good, but in the actual film, the actual plot There's no reason for this to be Garfield. This could be literally any other cartoon cat. His sarcasm and his intelligence and his wit are completely absent. But what's so baffling to me is that all these traits are given to Odie. Often in Garfield media, Odie is portrayed as dumb, and he's often tricked by Garfield into doing things for him. But then very occasionally and very surprisingly, Odie demonstrates extreme intelligence or has some crazy skill that no one saw coming. And that's where the humor is. That's the joke, is that he's dumb, but then sometimes he surprises you. That's a joke. But in this, Odie is depicted as being extremely capable and extremely intelligent at every turn, while Garfield is a big idiot. I don't think at any point in the film Odie is depicted as being a dumb dog. I think in this, Odie feels a lot more like Snoopy than he does Odie. In this whole film, Garfield never overcomes anyone with his intelligence. He's never even the smartest in the room because Odie is always there. So the classic Garfield and Odie dynamic isn't there. What about the dynamic with John? Is that there? Well, that's also not there because John is barely in the film. He doesn't interact with the main plot at all. Sometimes we just cut to him looking sad, calling people on the phone. Feels like such a waste to me, considering that the plot of this film centers around Garfield reconnecting with his biological father. It feels like there was an easy thread to make here about biological family versus found family, but it is not addressed at any point. In that way, it could have felt like Garfield on the Town, where it was meaningful in a very warm way. It feels like maybe the first draft of this film was more about that, and then they took it in a different direction. Also worth noting, Garfield's mother isn't brought up once. Not even a hint of a reference, which I think is a huge shame. The main trio in this film is Garfield, Odie, and Vic. However, like kind of at the midway point, we're introduced to Otto the bull. He agrees to help them break into a place called Lactose Farms under the condition that they help him free his love interest, Ethel. At this point, I've mentioned pretty much every main character in the film. Ethel's not really a character, she's just more of a motivation for Otto. I think she gets like 2 lines total. Actually, there's also Marge. She's an animal control officer. Marge ended up not getting a lot to do in this. Liz makes a 5-second cameo appearance. This behind me, that's the whole appearance of Liz. Arlene is not seen or mentioned. However, Nermal and even Binky the Clown make an appearance. I don't think I talked about Binky. Snoop Dogg's character, as well as the rest of Vic's old crew, are all references to the enemy cat gang from Garfield on the Town. I didn't see that anywhere. I worked that out all by myself. But it's crazy to me that they reference a literal background cat over the mother. Another one of Garfield's main traits is that he eats a lot and he's a big guy. It's still referred to. He breaks a set of scales, but he's probably the 2nd or 3rd smallest character in this. Vic is the size of 4 Garfields and he's a starving street cat. Jinx is so much bigger and she was in prison for 5 years. One of the henchmen is a massive dog. Otto the bull, again, is a freaking cow. Even the cat voiced by Snoop Dogg is bigger than Garfield. So Garfield's size never really interacts with the plot, and he loves eating. He freaking loves eating in this. It never impacts his decisions. He doesn't feel like food motivated. It's just something he does on the side. Feels like a lot of what I've talked about so far is what's not in the film, being engaging characters and laughter. So let's talk about what is in the film. Well, for starters, there's a lot of mobile phones. Everybody's got a mobile phone. The film opens with Garfield on his phone, getting food delivery service, which is flown in on a drone. This film can't stress enough how much Garfield loves the drone delivery service. When Garfield and Odie are first kidnapped, they're taken to an abandoned mall, because malls are dead. Nobody goes to malls anymore. We get stuff delivered now, from our phones. Now let's jump ahead to the climax of the film. Garfield needs to save his biological father from being thrown off a train. What is Garfield's major skill set? What can he do better than anyone else? What is his superpower? Well, of course, it is super consumerism. No one can order stuff from his phone better than Garfield. He orders so much stuff and there's so many drones. And using his superior athletic ability, he jumps from drone to drone, throwing food at his enemies. And when the day is saved, how does Garfield celebrate? He orders things from the Walmart app, which is promptly delivered by FedEx. I wish I was joking. Did you know FedEx is working on a drone delivery service? Well, you do now. Do you think the two are related? Me neither. It's almost like presenting the concept in a kid's film makes us more comfortable with the concept of drones replacing human workers. This film is a corporate psyop. Or maybe I'm looking too deep into it. It's not just FedEx and Walmart that have product placement in this. Roborock robotic vacuums get a big feature. It's like the machine uprising has already begun. Garfield talks about Olive Garden. He's seen eating pop chips. They mention Tinder, Bumble, and also there's references to Netflix. I don't normally care about product placement, like at all, but this film makes it really hard to ignore it, especially because I consider Garfield to be such a marketable character. Tacked onto the end of the film is a montage of clips of real-life cute animal videos. As I said earlier in the video, this is kind of partially what I think Garfield should be, like a relatable cat meme, and it almost feels like they forgot that while making this. Like they didn't realize until it was too late. Feels like an afterthought, such an afterthought that they had to literally put it in the credits. After almost 50 years, the essence of Garfield has been watered down into such a nothing character. Because that's what he is in this film. He's nothing. This film was nothing. This isn't my Garfield, and after watching it, it doesn't feel like Jim Davis's Garfield either. And that dude did some pretty wacky stuff. I don't see kids leaving this film thinking that Garfield was their favorite character. Vic and Odie maybe, but not Garfield. If anything, kids are just gonna leave with a newfound love for drone delivery technology. But I'm sure this film will make like a gazillion dollars and be loved by many. Just for me, after all of this really wasn't what I was hoping for. I think the main thing that I've learned is that Garfield isn't a character, he's an idea. He hates Mondays. He loves lasagna. He's sarcastic and he's lazy. He's a big guy. He's a house cat, but he's also a singer. He's a dancer. He's a detective. He's a prince. He's a chef. He's a cowboy. He's a pirate. He's a leader. He's a prisoner. He isn't funny. He is funny. He's being buried alive. He's a caretaker. He's Chris Pratt, Lorenzo Music, Bill Murray, and Frank Welker. He's a superhero. He's saving Odie from a television host. He's watching Odie fall into a volcano. He's fighting a panther. He's a romantic. He's a brother. He's the son to a mother, father, and a John. He yearns for your validation, and he is surreal. He is emerging from the ocean. He's begging for release. He's being airdropped onto a kaiju. He's escaping on a helicopter. He's fleeing into our reality. He's facing impossible odds. He's listening to one final song, and he is struck down, but he is revived. For he is God, a being of unfathomable depths, a vessel of creativity. But Garfield, above all else, you're the star of a comic strip. Oh, I liked him better in the bag.